Breaking news. King Charles has taken a step that the United Kingdom has not seen in 75 years. For the first time since the abdication crisis, the British monarchy has directly questioned how Parliament is operating. This is not a symbolic gesture. This is a genuine challenge to the way the government works, and what triggered it, plus what may happen next, could reshape British politics for an entire generation. If you want to truly understand what is happening inside Westminster right now, this story matters. This situation isn't based on rumors or guesses. Everything is documented. And it began with an event that surprised even people inside the government. Here's exactly what happened yesterday morning. At 9:47 a.m., King Charles called an emergency meeting of the Privy Council. These meetings normally follow a predictable schedule, often arranged well in advance. But this one was different. It wasn't routine. It wasn't ceremonial. It wasn't expected. It appeared suddenly, without public notice, and everyone understood something serious was unfolding. Inside the historic chamber at St. James's Palace, senior advisors and constitutional experts took their seats. People who had attended Privy Council meetings for years said they had never seen the atmosphere so tense. When the king entered, the room fell into complete silence. And when he spoke, it became clear that this was no ordinary address. He did not speak as a figure expected to simply read what others prepared. He spoke as someone who believed the system itself was drifting away from its essential principles. His message was precise. Britain's legislative process, he argued, is moving away from the standards that once kept it balanced and accountable. He said courts were now making policy decisions rather than interpreting laws. He said controversial bills were being moved through Parliament with very little debate or review. He pointed out that public consultation, which should happen before laws are finalised, was being done only after decisions had already been made. And the most serious concern he raised was that Parliament seemed to have started acting as though it answered only to itself, ignoring the public it is meant to represent. This was not an opinion shared casually. It was a constitutional concern raised formally through a legitimate channel. But this moment did not come out of nowhere. People close to the palace had been sending quiet warnings to the government for months. In fact, we reviewed internal communications showing that the King's constitutional team sent detailed letters to Number 10 exactly 3 weeks ago. These were not vague complaints. They listed specific examples of bills that were rushed through without transparent public involvement. The Prime Minister's office saw the letters. They studied them. And then they chose not to bring the matter forward to Parliament or to the public. That decision played a central role in what happened next. It left the Crown with two options: remain silent and watch the system drift further, or use constitutional powers that most modern monarchs never touch. King Charles chose to act. And the reason he acted is simple. A constitutional system only works when all parts play their role. The Crown has a role. Parliament has a role. The courts have a role. And the public has the most important role. When one part stops listening to the others, the system is at risk. That is not a theory, it is a historical fact in many countries. Then came the moment that everyone is now talking about. Yesterday, at the state opening of Parliament, a ceremony that has run smoothly for 7 decades, King Charles did something genuinely unprecedented. He deviated from the government-approved speech. British monarchs are not expected to improvise. Their speeches are written by the government, word for word. But this time, the king added his own unscripted comments. He looked at MPs and said clearly, "This Parliament must remember it serves the people, not the other way around." He went further, saying that when laws passed in Parliament ignore what the public has expressed through referendums, when new rules are introduced with almost no public consultation, and when long-time politicians focus more on procedures than on consequences, the entire constitutional framework begins to weaken. The chamber froze. You could see the surprise moving across the benches. Labour ministers shifted uncomfortably. The Chancellor stared down at her speech notes. The Deputy Prime Minister visibly paled. Everyone understood what had just happened. The monarchy had signalled that the government had crossed a line. Within minutes, clips of those unscripted comments were spread online. Within hours, they were being shared globally. By the next morning, the video had been watched 47 million times across platforms. But the real impact happened inside Parliament. A divide appeared almost immediately. 27 Labour MPs signed a letter backing the King's constitutional right to speak up. And these were not rebels or fringe figures. 3 were former cabinet ministers, and 5 were chairs of important parliamentary committees. Their message was clear: they believed the Prime Minister had pushed the boundaries too far. Inside the cabinet, the unity that the government tried to project began to crack. Senior ministers started offering conflicting statements. Some defended the government's decisions. Others said the King had raised legitimate concerns. One cabinet member, speaking to BBC Radio 4, said, "When the Crown speaks, responsible government listens." Inside Number 10, according to staff who were present, emergency meetings turned chaotic. Deputy Prime Minister Angela Rayner reportedly told the Prime Minister directly, "You ignored warnings from the palace. We are all paying for it now." She then walked out in frustration. Meanwhile, the Chancellor, responsible for safeguarding Britain's financial reputation, refused to appear publicly. No interviews. No statements. Nothing. When a finance minister goes silent during a constitutional crisis, it is a sign of deep internal uncertainty. And the financial markets responded quickly. Within 90 minutes of the King's speech, the pound fell 1.3% against the dollar. That meant £8.7 billion was wiped off the UK's economic value before lunchtime. Government bonds sold off, and the yield on 10-year debt spiked, meaning the government will now face higher borrowing costs. International reactions poured in. Foreign ministers from Germany, France, and Canada contacted Whitehall demanding immediate explanations. Japanese investment firms holding billions in British assets requested emergency calls with the Treasury. They wanted to know if the UK was still a stable place to invest. Credit rating agencies then released statements saying they were closely monitoring the situation. In plain terms, if the crisis did not settle quickly, the UK could face a downgrade, which would cost billions more in borrowing. At this stage, the situation had clearly moved beyond politics. It had become an economic risk. But behind everything happening publicly, there was another issue influencing how the public reacted, something the political establishment has been reluctant to address. Britain's military veterans are struggling with basic dignity, retirement support, and healthcare. Consider John Morrison, a 67-year-old former Royal Marine from Plymouth. He served for 22 years. He has been waiting 9 months for a hip replacement and is in constant pain. His pension no longer keeps up with rising prices, and his savings are shrinking. Another veteran, Sarah Jenkins, served as a military nurse in Kosovo and Afghanistan. She treated wounded soldiers under dangerous conditions. Today, she is choosing between heating her home and buying enough food. She survives on £940 per month. Meanwhile, MPs enjoy subsidised bars, multiple taxpayer-funded homes, and expense accounts that often exceed £200,000 per year. The contrast is not just a financial problem, it is a matter of moral responsibility. And although King Charles did not intervene specifically for this reason, the public saw him as speaking to a deeper truth: institutions have lost touch with the people they are supposed to represent. Political insiders were surprised to learn that Charles was not standing alone. Several former prime ministers from both major parties privately indicated that they thought his actions were constitutionally justified. Tony Blair has been consulted on historical examples. Gordon Brown, usually a strong defender of Parliament's authority, told palace officials that he believed raising constitutional concerns was appropriate. Even the Archbishop of Canterbury, who typically stays quiet on political matters, spoke up. He said that when institutions fail to serve the real interests of the public, it is the duty of every institution, including the Church and the Crown, to speak honestly. Senior military leaders, including General Sir Patrick Sanders, also expressed support. He wrote that institutional stability is more important than short-term political convenience. All of this shows the King is not acting alone. People from across the political and institutional spectrum are sending a similar message: Parliament needs to realign its priorities. Now the focus shifts to what happens next. Parliament returns on Monday for an emergency constitutional session. Labour's National Executive Committee meets Tuesday. Meanwhile, constitutional experts are preparing legal opinions on exactly what powers the Crown still holds under the UK's unwritten constitution. According to political insiders, 3 scenarios are now being discussed. First, the government tries to ignore the crisis, defend its record, and move on as usual. But with senior ministers breaking ranks and public support shifting, this path likely leads to an election disaster within months. Second, Labour MPs force a vote of no confidence. Based on the mood inside the party, this could succeed. The main question would then be who replaces the Prime Minister, and whether that person can rebuild public trust. Third, the crisis leads to a real reset. Controversial bills are paused. Parliament begins meaningful constitutional review. Leaders work to rebuild trust between Parliament and the public. This is the most time-consuming option, but may be the only way to stabilise the system. Every path puts pressure on the government. This moment represents something deeper. Democracies need balance. No single branch, Parliament, courts, or executive, should hold unchecked authority. The monarchy has long played a subtle constitutional role, even when its powers are rarely used. The fact that a monarch actually used those powers now shows that Parliament pushed beyond what the system considers acceptable. This isn't about personalities. It's about systems. Systems fail when parts stop communicating. Governments lose legitimacy when institutions stop respecting each other's roles. The question now is simple: will Parliament remember that it represents the people, not just the politicians inside it? The next 3 days will be crucial. The emergency session, the internal cabinet decisions, the shifts in public opinion, everything matters. If you want clear, honest coverage without political spin, stay tuned. Tell us in the comments, did Parliament overstep? Does the Crown have the right to intervene? What do you think should happen next? We read every comment. Share this with anyone who wants to understand what is happening in Westminster, not the headlines, but the real picture. Tomorrow, we are releasing a complete explanation of Britain's unwritten constitution, how it functions, why it's facing pressure now, and what past examples tell us about where this might lead. This story matters. Stay informed.